Hello and welcome to Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer. I'm Ann Hess. There's been mounting global pressure to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and one way to do that is through genetic improvements and genetic innovation. Joining us to discuss this topic and more is Dr. Lindsay Case, Director, New Product Commercialization for PIC. Welcome, Dr. Case, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Anne.
Before we jump into today's discussion, I'd like to remind the audience tuning in, you can post your questions at any time in the chat, or if you're tuning in via social media, you can post those there in the comments. So, Lindsay, let's kick off the discussion by starting with that global pressure to cut emissions. What are we seeing companies across the globe now demanding from their suppliers, and what countries are leading the charge thus far?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to start with, Anne. And I know a lot of the group on the call today is based in the US. So in the US, we're seeing some regulatory easing at the federal level around climate disclosures. However, that does not mean climate pressure has disappeared at all. And much of today's pressure, as you mentioned in the question, is really market driven more than government driven. So, what are companies demanding of their suppliers? Thinking globally, companies are asking for suppliers to reduce scope 1 and 2 and increasingly scope 3 emissions. They're asking for product level transparency, often through life cycle assessment, which we will be talking about in a little bit. They're looking for evidence of reduction plans, not just reporting, and traceability and documentation that can substantiate and support those reduction plans. So the big shift is from an integrated production standpoint, suppliers are considering customers, including pork producers, as part of the longer term climate path. And who's really leading the charge in this continues to be the European Union, and they remain one of the most aggressive regulators on carbon transparency. Particularly in agriculture, Denmark has passed legislation to price livestock methane, or the carbon or the cow burp tax, as it's been called. And the EU also has a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that's really setting the precedent that imports may need to reflect carbon costs. So when we think about producers, packers, and pork exports in North America, the pressure for key international customers, including the European Union, are starting to pressure potential need for ongoing greenhouse gas reductions in the US and North American agricultural sector. And other key export markets, including in Southeast Asia, are really watching and learning from the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU and starting to develop similar approaches. So even if the US policy is softening temporarily, global trade is certainly moving towards carbon transparency and carbon reductions. And given the importance of exports for the North American swine industry, I really do think that matters.
So with that all that pressure and demand for those products, how does that align with goals from organizations such as FAO?
So the FAO has consistently emphasized that agri-food systems need to reduce emissions while maintaining and increasing global food security, which means more nutritious protein available to the global population. And with that, they recognize that livestock, including pork production, is both part of the challenge, being one of the largest emitting sectors of agriculture, but it also makes it possible for agriculture to be a bigger part of the solution. So instead of trying to cut total emissions from the agricultural sector, knowing that we continue to need to produce more nutrition for a global growing population, the FAO is focusing on improving emissions intensity. So really reducing the emissions associated with each pound of product or each pound of pork produced. FAO's modeling to try and reduce emissions intensity per pound of pork produced is really focused on ways to drive productivity gains to reduce emissions per pound of pork. So things like improving feed efficiency, improving herd health, improving survivability, many of those different production metrics. And when we think from our perspective and what role we can play with Pig Improvement Company, genetic improvement is specifically focused on improving the productivity of global swine production systems. So we consider genetics one of the highest potential tools to leverage to reduce the emissions intensity in pork production. And we aren't the only ones thinking that, because the FAO has identified genetics as one of the primary drivers or opportunities for achieving increased productivity of the global agricultural system and a way to reduce that emissions intensity per pound of protein produced.
So I want to go back. You mentioned life cycle assessment and in the beginning. Explain for us what it is and what it means for pork production.
Yeah, great question. A life cycle assessment, often referred to as an LCA, is a standard method to measure the environmental impact across the full life cycle of a product. So, practically for us in pork production, it means from producing the grains, processing the feed, feeding the animals and raising the animals on the farm, and getting a live pig to the production to the slaughter plant. So it's really from the feed to the pig delivered to the plant, the entire environmental impact of raising pork today. And the important thing with an LCA or life cycle assessment is it allows us to objectively quantify greenhouse gas emissions per pound of pork. And within the modeling methodology, it allows us to identify where emissions are highest, which for us in the livestock sector typically involves production of the feed and the grains that go into that feed, as well as manure management. So the life cycle assessment itself not only quantifies the environmental impact of producing the product, but it can also help producers and companies focus on hotspots where improvements matter the most and where interventions can have the highest impact at reducing that emissions intensity for pork. So practically what it means is it allows us to not just speak about sustainability more holistically, but it actually allows us to measure it and come up with continuous improvement strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the pork sector.
Now, I understand PIC's developed a system to quantify greenhouse gases reductions by genetic improvements. Tell us more about that and the data that's been collected thus far.
Yeah, that's what we're calling genetic carbon, or the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions through genetic improvement and genetic innovation. So, what we were able to do is quantify really the productivity gains associated with genetic improvement and genetic innovation, use that life cycle assessment or LCA methodology to convert the productivity gains associated with genetic improvement to a quantified reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So what we're able to quantify is that by using a full program PIC genetics, the greenhouse gas emissions are 7.5% lower in North America for using that more efficient product. We replicated that methodology in different areas around the world. And in Asia, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by using full program PIC genetics is over 10% in countries like Japan and China. So we were able to take this methodology and really quantify what that increased productivity associated with genetic improvement means on that new environmental measuring stick to unlock a new environmental attribute for producers today.
That's quite a significant reduction. Um, so PIC's partnered with Pork Checkoff on a carbon claiming framework. Detail for us where that project is at and how it works along the entire pork supply chain.
Yeah, great question. So quantifying credibly and defensively the impact of an environmental intervention, and for us, that's the impact of genetic improvement and genetic innovation, really results in that credible 7.5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. What we worked on with the National Pork Board is how do we make that accessible as an environmental claim to producers across the industry? And that's where the framework comes in. So to make a credible claim, we need to prove that the intervention was in place. So were the certain genetics in the sow farm, with a certain sire line represented in those market pigs, tracking the pigs from the sow farm through the growing barns to the packing plant to have a really credible passport for that intervention through the live side of pork production to the slaughter plant. Then within the framework, we're focused on calculating the total emissions associated with producing pigs from a certain flow, so we can reduce that by 7.5% by applying the intervention. So the framework with the National Pork Board is really about how can producers take this life cycle assessment and use it to create credible and defensible reduction claims for their packer, and how can the packer then pass that on to their customers. And that's what the framework's allowing us to do in real pork production systems.
So, what's next for PIC's work in this area?
Next is to pilot this. So we're working with Protein Pact to create a real world demonstration of using the environmental or the greenhouse gas reductions enabled by genetic improvement, so the 7.5% reduction in pork production, using the framework we created with the National Pork Board and building up the real world data management and data verification system for that to be executed. So demonstrating it with packers, ideally one in the US and one in Canada, starting in North America, and having a pork producer in their packer make that credible defensible claim from genetic carbon within their live production system is the next step. So working with a couple packers to pilot it and then being able to really seamlessly scale that to other live production systems around the US and around the globe is what we're currently focusing on.
I look forward to seeing that roll out. I'd like to remind the audience again, if you have any questions for Dr. Case, please post them there in the chat, or if you're viewing via social media there in the comments. So, as we wrap up our discussion here today, any key takeaways, final thoughts to leave our audience?
Yeah, particular for a US based audience right now, it can seem like the direction of the winds around climate commitments and sustainability targets can be changing. But what we're seeing evolving from corporate pressures and key export partners, including the EU and Asia, is there is a forward march towards climate smart practices being important in a credible and defensible way in live production systems. So I think looking at ways to future proof growing sustainability pressures into the future in ways that make the core business more productive, more efficient, and more profitable is the best strategy right now. So by using something like genetic carbon and using genetic improvement, which was making production systems more efficient and profitable anyway, and then being able to communicate and quantify the reduced greenhouse gas emissions by something producers are already doing anyway, is a really smart way to start future proofing the ability to make environmental commitments and reduction claims when the winds change and the pressure continues to mount in the future.
Dr. Lindsay Case, PIC, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insight.
Thank you, Anne.
For you and our audience, we thank you for tuning in today. For more coverage and conversations on pork industry related topics, be sure to check out the Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer websites, as well as our social media channels. For Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.